Good evening. I shall begin. I'm going to be talking about cloud and company culture. Background to this and a bit of background about myself. I have worked across pretty much most sectors and in some very, very unusual ones as well. I was chief architect for the Olympics, which is something I never expected as an example. So the basis of this is typically because when the companies move towards cloud or they were thinking of going to the cloud, people don't realize that there's a lot of fluffy elements around there rather than the technology that actually makes or breaks the move to cloud. And in many cases, when I work with C-level executives, I am involved in very ethereal, fluffy conversations that the CEO has a vision and he wants to execute on the vision. And my job is to think about how to execute that vision, create roadmaps, strategic avenues into creating value creation from cloud. And in many cases, what makes or breaks a deal is the fact that the company culture is usually neglected. To get a case in point, again, just picking a random technology out from the air, Salesforce. I've seen Salesforce implementations fail, but not because the technology is bad, but because the culture wasn't conducive to actually allow that technology to work. And I'm sure most people who've been in IT, again, I'm not a veteran in IT, by the way, so it's just I've been lucky in my career to have moved up the chain very, very quickly. So I've seen a lot of failures, and it's exactly that reason, is because no one's realized that ultimately whatever technology you put in a company, unless you're a startup, there's some crap in there, pardon the language, that you have to deal with. And sometimes crap comes in various places, and it's usually at the place where you don't expect either. And people using the systems, if they don't like the systems, they're not going to use it. Simple as that. So this is the kind of background to this, and it's kind of giving people a different perspective on cloud. If you're anything like myself and you've had a really long week, you don't want PowerPoint, so I've kept the PowerPoint slides very simple and very picturesque, so please enjoy the pictures. And it's literally just at any point in time, please interject and have a chat. I'm trying to keep this interactive as possible. Okay, what's on the menu? So, very quick. Just going to be talking around the kind of elements to consider when looking at cloud. And again, when I say cloud, I look at it both ways, both moving on to the cloud, evolving on the cloud, but also moving off the cloud. And many companies are actually moving away from it. So I'll kind of highlight the reasons why as well. Technology. So first thing to consider is it's always about technology, and people talk about cloud and they think, okay, there's a variety of platforms that exist. You'll hear various kind of synonyms, adjectives to describe the nature of cloud systems. You've got private, hybrid, public. Also, by the way, I've got my notes here because my brain's losing its concentration, so I've got something to prompt me. So apologies if I keep on looking down. Also, in many cases, companies are also maturing on the cloud because cloud's been around for a while. When I use the term for a while, it's relative terms in technology because things move at a very fast pace now. So in many cases, when I'm advising companies, it's because they want to mature or they want to get better or they want to realize value from their use of the cloud. Again, there's considerations about moving on the cloud, moving off the cloud as well. So there's, again, people tend to revolve more around the technology, but reality is ultimately what we're trying to do by utilizing cloud technologies is enablement of choices. We're trying to choose a landscape or an ecosystem that can enable the business to make the choices as well in a slightly more fluid fashion. So that's kind of the technology world. This slide is because I've got a 4-year-old niece who kept on looking at my shoulder and she's into Minions at the moment. So essentially it's also about people because many people forget sometimes that if you're using cloud, it's also about impacting the people in the organization. And again, sometimes it has an impact on organizational structure. A good example is if you implement a platform as a service, whether it be Salesforce, whether you go for kind of Heroku, etc., you're going to alter how your company works because ultimately you've got a machine that's running. You have BAU, you have operations. In many cases, again, I'm not an advocate or anti-Salesforce, just using an example for case in point, is if you implement such a product, you're not necessarily going to have to go to developers all the time if something breaks. You might be operational staff who have an understanding of development. So in that case, you go into the world of DevOps. It's not because you wanted to, or it's the latest, greatest buzzword, or it's the next best thing. It's just because your company is naturally evolving to that model in terms of getting the operational machine running. So it's considerations about this as well. In some cases, traditional roles evolve as well, and it has an impact on people. So for example, if you look at cloud technologies now, many people are moving away from the traditional sysadmin that role has morphed into many other forms. In some cases, people are moving into the world of automation, puppet, chef, etc., which were mentioned earlier. In other cases, people are moving towards kind of becoming developers and developing code. So their roles move from doing sysadmin and scripts to now writing code, because Amazon, for example, allows you to script an entire infrastructure if you need be. Process. What cloud does, again, it's a generic 80-20 rule, is that it'll enable better process to take place. But again, there's the assumption there's a bit of thought that's gone into it. Concepts such as continuous delivery, continuous integration get enabled faster with cloud technologies. Also, kind of when you, as I mentioned earlier, when you've got the ability to script an entire infrastructure and spin up an entire infrastructure that copies a production environment and pre-production, you can create replicated environments. Again, these are enablers to ultimately get kind of value generation. In some cases, you've got inhibitors as well. So for example, if you move to cloud and you want to do all this agile stuff, which everyone talks about, and you've got you're in a very traditional vertical, so for example, regulations or compliant led, ITIL may be in place. Government is a case in point. So ITIL typically is seen as the enemy of agile because you end up with change control, release management. So although you've got a very agile iterative process, ultimately everything has to go into conveyor belt and someone has to approve and click it. In other cases, you've got a supply chain that you need to deal with. So ultimately ITIL is there as well. So there may be implications on how things are done. And if your company is ITIL compliant and everyone in operations has gone through their ITIL certifications, do they have any value, or does that need to be rethought? And there's no magic bullet for this, to be honest. It depends a lot, again, back on company culture.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? Because actually the issue about agile is to do it in an ITIL way.
Yes.
Here is an effective process that we can do it very quickly, we can cycle round, but if you break that process even in doing something agile, you just end up with rubbish that doesn't work.
Exactly, and ultimately what kind of cloud gives you is a big playground. The danger of the big playground is also, I don't want to use the term control, but ultimately you're incurring a bigger risk penalty on what you put out there in operations.
That's exactly what we saw with RAD tools in the 90s, where everything could be done really quick, can't it? So the RAD tools all just had a huge bucket full of rubbish in them, while they had the bits that actually worked. No one ever took out the rubbish that was there.
Pretty much, yeah. So one way to look at cloud is from a technology analogy perspective, it's similar to what Agile gives you from a delivery perspective. It enables you, providing you've got the right mix of things together. And also, that right mix is not necessarily right for every company. So it's kind of picking and choosing, but being smart about how you move towards Agile, to the cloud, but also if you actually need to move to the cloud. And I'll get onto that point a bit later on. There's a point made around security as well. Just to throw another bit in the mix. If you're an SME, or if you're a startup, or if you're a company that can't invest into security staff too much, would you rather offload your risk to somebody like Google who's got armies and armies of people who do security, or Microsoft, versus doing it yourself? So there's a question around that side of it as well, is would you rather offload their footprint? But as long as you're smart about how you utilize the product, Amazon gives you particular ways of managing security, as does kind of Google, as does Azure, etc. But ultimately it's kind of looking at the principles. In many perspectives, your key commodity is data, which is something that I'm coming on to now. And reality is, people talk about data, they talk about big data. Reality is, it's always been about data. It's just the realization now that data is actually it has a slightly more value to it, because you can actually see under the covers about what the data gives you. So ultimately, every security framework, every security principle, you look at it from a very high level perspective, which is kind of what CEOs and CIOs do anyway, it's about controlling data. Who has access to it, at the right time, and at the right context, with the right reason to you look at that data as well. So this brings me on to kind of the data world. And in many organizations, some organizations realize it more than others. Ultimately, your key asset is data, whether it be customer data, whether it be transactional data, whether it be realized data, which is a value of combining customer data and transactional data. So you get BI, the world of business intelligence. You also have predictive data, which is now coming up, enabled. I don't want to use the term big data, because big data is a relative term. It's more around looking at unstructured data and creating relative relationships to data. It's just that now we can do things a bit more faster. That's what it boils down to. Also, part of the problem and challenge is that although you can move to cloud, and it alleviates the traditional barriers to IT, things like scalability, security, etc., all the non-functional requirements that you typically expect in the architecture world. It creates other barriers. And what I mean by those are, in many cases, again, having worked in government, is you end up with these really unusual challenges about things like data location, data privacy, data value, because if you think about it, data itself might not have any value, but if you start combining data and doing mishmashes, suddenly you realize actually this data is pretty valuable. And you start thinking, okay, legislation, policy, regulations, compliance haven't even caught up with that yet. Insurance is a case in point where somebody might be able to, if they can garnish your health data from your phone, would they be able to use that to upscale or downscale your premium for your insurance if they realize you're a high risk candidate? Who's got control of the data? Who's got that value? Who actually owns the data? Who's got the right to see it? Who's got the right to use it? So you end up in these very unusual situations where you're realizing that you're creating barriers which you never expected.
It's actually even more complex than that, because if you look at the safeguarding rules at the moment, and safeguarding is a really big issue now, if you have a child who is a section, I think it's 46, which is the at immediate risk,
yeah.
The state has an obligation to do things in a completely different way to if they are section 19, which is at a lower level of risk. So all the rules that you do depend on a person's assessment of that particular situation at that time. So this melding of people and their decision making to the access rules on the data that they're allowed to use is.
And interestingly, there was a use case I was working with the Minister of Justice, who's one of my clients. And when you enable these kind of tools, I'm going to use an analogy, but I don't mean it as an insult. It's a bit like giving a monkey a machine gun. Because what happens is you give people so much data, so much value, but the end person making, or in a team making that decision, they go crazy with it, because suddenly you've given them not just one data point to make a decision of, you've actually given them 30. And they realize actually now we can make decisions and we can make this bureaucracy even more complicated. So rather than using one flag to identify an individual, you've got 30 flags. And each time you evaluate another client, you have to go through the same 30 flags again. So you're creating layers and layers of bureaucracy, so it gets ever more complex. So the last piece is actually the bit people don't think about, culture. And that's the kind of, in many cases, the make or break. Culture can be at an individual level, it can be at a group level, it can be at an organizational level, it can even be sometimes at an enterprise level. So this is when you're dealing with massive multinationals. And in many cases, when I've been in kind of very traditional sectors, there's again, I don't tend to be sexist, but you've got the old boys clubs, the people who don't want to change. They've got a little group, they're comfortable. Why do you want to change? They've got a cushy job, they're waiting for retirement, blah, 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 the usual. And suddenly you end up in this world where everyone's got this kind of there's a political fear of moving towards the cloud, because ultimately you're letting go of your traditional skill set and moving on to something new, and not many people are kind of want to move to new sometimes, and that has to be appreciated as well, that you're not going to change anyone. In many cases, cloud also gives you the ability to collaborate better as well, and collaboration occurs at multiple levels through technology teams, operational teams, service delivery teams, agile teams. By nature, it opens up that kind of world which is traditionally a black box. If you're moving to the cloud, inherently one of the advantages you may or may not get is agility in the business as well, and rapid adaptability to market change. Inevitably, as a consequence, you have to collaborate. And there's pros and cons. The pros is you get to see more. The cons are you probably didn't want to see everything in the first place when you realize what there is to see. And also, there's a promise sometimes of the cloud that everything's going to get better. That's not necessarily the case. So in many cases, people oversell the cloud internally within the company, or somebody comes in and sells that to the company and say, yep, this will solve all of your problems. And there's a high expectation when things don't get met, everyone hates it. And you get the reverse feel as well. So again, that's impacting the company culture and the uptake. Rate of change in a company, generally what I've found is when they adopt cloud, it increases. It doesn't increase for the better necessarily, it just increases. Again, it's because people, especially I'm going to use the term the business, and I'm going to contradict myself later on, is the business themselves think, oh, this is a huge magical thing. It's going to make everything go faster, so now I can throw even more stuff at technology and they can deliver it even better. And those kind of promises, they're not exactly the best, so it's kind of managing expectations and being slightly smart about things as well. And back to the point which I'm going to contradict myself on, which is many organizations have this kind of traditional divide between business and technology, and they expect the technology to service the business. Reality is everyone's in for the same reason. They're just doing different roles. So what happens is when you create cloud technologies, or implement cloud technologies, whether it be end user computing or transactional systems or data systems, etc., what you find is that divide actually starts breaking down, because what happens is the business actually realize that I need to be smarter about how I ask things in technology, and also I'm owning the prioritization about what actually happens in the technology side. So you kind of shift the delivery focus and make technology the product owner. So they kind of look after what the request is and manage the priorities, and technology delivers to that. So you essentially end up with technology as a service model internally within organizations. And then what happens is the technology can go back and say, okay, you want this, but it means this, because we don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the resources. So there's kind of a balance between the two, and people start appreciating actually there's no unlimited bandwidth in technology. Cloud kind of, in many cases, enables that conversation to happen. That conversation is probably already happening. It just means that it gets accelerated in some cases. And in many cases, when I've gone into companies and a CEO said something, I want to do cloud, I want to do this, and he talks about the problems in the company, politically sometimes it's actually just because the nature of the current infrastructure, the current system is such, because you've got an entire culture bedded around with it, it just makes political sense sometimes just to say, okay, we're just going to move to the cloud, because it kind of has a fresh thinking and a fresh idea span on everyone else within the organization. So ultimately it's about evolving, and that's kind of what we're doing with the cloud, and cloud itself is evolving. So as is one kind of status, to be. So when I'm kind of advising C-level executives is also to make sure that everyone has a goal to hit. The nature of a vision is that you never execute to the vision, and it remains very ethereal and fluffy, and it remains on a PowerPoint slide somewhere. So it's kind of making sure that whatever you're trying to go for, that future vision is something that you can actually achieve realistically as well. It's also one thing to appreciate also is that the cloud world is evolving itself. It's very organic. So you might go to adopt a cloud technology today, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best one a year down the line. So it's understanding that you need to be flexible in your thought process as well. And ultimately, you need to have an exit strategy as well. Many people go into cloud infrastructures and cloud systems without actually understanding of how they're going to get off it as well. And there may be a variety of reasons why you want to get off it. There may be implications around security. There may be a security breach. It may be that data locations hit something, or your customer segmentation's moved. You might end up in Germany, where in Germany they say we just want our data in Germany, so you may have to rethink your entire platform because you want to host in Germany, or you end up in China, or kind of weird and wonderful markets like that. A key is basically making sure that part of the ability to drive culture is to make sure that the company understands that if you don't adapt, you're not going to survive. And everyone's in there, and everyone gets their pay packet, because ultimately someone somewhere has had that thought process to drive the company in a particular fashion so everyone can get a paycheck, and is staying ahead of the competition ideally, or at least keeping up with it. And not to be scared of a disruptive culture. What cloud gives you in many cases is the ability to be disruptive. Many traditional organizations have a fear of doing that. Case in point, government as well, where I've kind of worked, and that was exactly the point which I found is there was a fear of moving into this disruptive, and let's try things out, let's kind of see and identify opportunities, because ultimately that's where your revenue generation might be. So key one is around leadership. So these are kind of the 5 recommendations typically on kind of sorting out your company culture. They're not magic bullet by any point, but again, it's a guidance. So typically when you implement cloud, you need advocates, and the advocates typically tend to be at C-level or board level, because that's where you have the biggest impact, and it kind of trickles down the organization. If you don't have that, it's going to be a bit of a struggle. And ultimately, these people will act as your representatives on the board as well, which is something that's needed. And they have to embrace this as well. They have to be bought into the reason and the view to moving to the cloud. It also has an impact on commercials as well. So ultimately, they're going to be the people facing off against the CFO and fighting the case for technology as well. It's a move to the cloud is kind of understanding and analyzing where you are currently and being smart about that as well, because in many cases people say, I want to move to the cloud. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to move to the cloud now. It may be that for whatever reason, you actually say, we're comfortable for the next 3 to 6 months and we can carve up a strategy and then move. So it's understanding your current ecosystem, your current behavior, your current segments, your current market, your current competition, and just kind of taking that step back and just being taking a retrospective. to a certain extent before saying, okay, we're going to adopt cloud technologies and just jumping into it. It's about benefits ultimately. So the question is, are you looking at moving immediately, mid-term, short-term? What are the benefits realized at each time scale? There's a point made around POCs. I'm kind of in this camp where I actually say MVP, which is kind of the danger of the POC is that you throw it away. MVP says you actually iteratively get on something and you start building on it, so you get continued value realization straight away, and the business sees the value straight away rather than having to wait for these big bang approaches. There's a question around rate of adaptability and rate of change, because what cloud gives you, what processes like Agile give you, is that your timescales and the concept of actually delivery will change as well, because suddenly something that you thought needs a year to get delivered, you can actually say, we can actually deliver a first cut in a month and then just kind of build on that. So it's kind of changing the focus and also making sure that the business realize what enablers that they're given with regards to the technology. Question around cloud. What cloud gives you also is the ability to create platforms. In the last 10 organizations I've done consultancy for, all of them have driven towards creating platforms internally, which they can then white label and sell on. That's what cloud gives you, is the ability to although you might have a particular reason to use your cloud infrastructure, you realize actually we can cookie cut this and there's many other people who would want something similar. So it gives you the ability to actually create these kind of vanilla platforms and sell on, as long as you're smart about how you create these platforms. So that's kind of introduces the world of APIs, microservices, etc., and all the kind of usual fun stuff that you can see within the architecture world at the moment. You need to there's a piece around comms. One thing I have found is in many cases when an organization is moving to cloud, comms is very poor, and the reason to move to cloud or the understanding as to why they need to move, how they're going to move, is very poorly communicated, and you have this kind of silos of communication that occur, and there's a fear, because what happens is if you don't hear about something, human nature is you're always going to think the worst, and that worst thing actually starts manifesting in this kind of cold dark room in your mind, and you always think the worst. And what happens is that fear gets played out in many, many ways. Some people start fearing about their job security, you name it, everything comes out of the work. So one thing I do advise kind of C-level is to make sure that they're always communicating with the company at all levels. And also within the teams, communication is always kind of is paramount. If you're going to be migrating off the cloud or on the cloud, again, you need the communications across these multifunction teams that you're going to be creating. It also kind of helps with loyalty. It's an unusual word, but it means that everyone's in it rather than just a few people doing the stuff. So it's that kind of joint effort to say, okay, if we're going to fail, we're going to fail together. If we're going to succeed, we're going to succeed together. That communication enables that loyalty. It also allows for things like crowdsourcing and idea kind of harnessing as well, because in many cases, people are actually very close to the systems, never get spoken to, and sometimes they actually might have very smart ideas. So it's harvesting those ideas in a smart fashion, and again, that comes through communications and having those clear lines of to and fro, both from kind of sea level all the way down to kind of ground level. And ultimately, there's a question earlier, and about how and why we move to the cloud, etc., and security, etc. Ultimately, it's all about risk, managing risk, because all companies, unless you're a startup, you're in BAU mode as well. So you're kind of changing the wheel as the car's moving. So you have to be smart about things as well, and kind of making sure that you don't disrupt the business as usual, because that's what brings the cash into the company, and altering the operational models that actually help and not hinder that, because. Again, case in point with DevOps, I've seen DevOps fail very, very miserably as well. And the reason is because the skill set wasn't right, the expectation wasn't right, and in some cases people's contracts weren't right with HR, because they were contracted to a particular set of hours within the day, and suddenly you're saying you're DevOps now, 24/7 rota. So there's an implication from an HR perspective as well, which people don't realize. So it's kind of realizing that you need to be smart about how you move towards cloud. Point was made earlier, which was kind of around operational cost models, which is kind of OPEX and CAPEX. The irony is that CTOs, CIOs, CFOs, etc., when discussing commercials, CAPEX is a comfortable thing to calculate because it's a bottom line. There's a certain amount of investment on there, but reality is cloud is more operational. Although CFOs like OPEX because it looks cheaper on the bottom line, it's actually harder to calculate on cloud. So you need people who can actually predict what cloud is going to cost you. So again, finger in the air, having kind of delivered a few systems. Amazon actually becomes more expensive over 3 years. You're actually better off, if you're going to have something longer than 3 years, to actually shove it in a data center and go for a managed, hosting provider. It just works out smarter. So being smart about the commercials is also key as well, because it means that actually you think in the short term, okay, cloud might be look magic, but if you're going to be there for the long haul, maybe it's actually worth investing in a private cloud, or actually spinning up, kind of going into a rack space or something like that. So again, I'm not advocating rack space. It's just an example I picked up in the air. And finally, part of the piece about risk, which we had a quick discussion around, was actually the implications around process as well. ITIL being one, change control, release management being another, and also bearing in mind that legal frameworks are changing as well. So if you're in a regulated or a sector that's led by compliance, there will be implications on there. So ultimately, you are managing risk to a certain extent. So that was kind of the talk. I have no idea about time, so it's an open forum. So please ask away.
Yeah, I've got one. Earlier on, you mentioned going onto a cloud platform, the importance of having an exit strategy.
Yep.
That kind of piques my curiosity a bit, because with any kind of choice of platform like that, you don't tend to choose Linux and MySQL and PHP or whatever else. You're not looking at that as a technology choice with a view for, oh well, what happens if we decide not to use Linux in the future? What happens if we want to go somewhere else?
Yeah.
By the time you're moving off whatever platform you're on, the environment, the landscape is very, very different. So you don't tend to have that exit strategy. You make the strategy for the transition at the point at which you recognise the transition is necessary.
Yeah.
Why is the cloud different? Why do you have to go into a cloud platform with an exit strategy in mind?
Your exit from the cloud could be determined for a variety of reasons. In some cases, it's been because there's a implication on the nature of your business, how it transacts. Particular platforms are not conducive to particular ways of doing business. So, for example, with government, a case in point, you may be able to use Heroku, Amazon, Azure, etc., for pretty much prototyping, but there's a very different use case when you actually go down production, because your data is going to be somewhere else. There may be an instance of their data shot into America, etc. Unless you've got those regulations in place, you may say, okay, we can use it for the short term for prototyping, but ultimately we need to get off the platform when we go production. That's one case. Another implication may be that the platform that you're on commercially is not viable for you anymore. In many cases, again, when I'm working at C-level, the reason I work with C-level is because in many cases these guys have been shipped into companies to make change, because the current situation is not right. So ultimately, at some point in time, someone's going to say, is that platform right for the business going forward? Because the strategy has changed, the market has changed, the reason for the business existing has changed, because your core reason for your business might change, because again, there's a realization that your value is actually elsewhere in another market or providing another service, and you need to move off the cloud. In other cases, you're going into a platform, but the platform's not right because the requirements weren't done right in the first place. So someone who actually did the business requirements capture piece didn't capture all the requirements in the way, or they missed something, and then you suddenly realize, oh, actually, it's a big problem for us. So they rather invest the money to get off the platform and find a new home rather than staying on the existing one and building on it. And also, in many cases, it's political as well, because, yeah, I think everyone's kind of aware of this anyway, so I'm going to say it. But reality is, in many cases, board level members, C-level members, when they get shipped into companies, they also bring their black book as well. So politically, sometimes it's just because they want their mates in the mix as well. So it may not necessarily mean that reality is it's the best for the companies, because they've got relationships which they want to leverage, and they get a cut out of it. So these are just examples of why people need to start thinking of exit strategies. It just means your move away from a platform is better. In some cases, it's because of a fear of vendor lock-in, and vendor lock-in comes in very strange shapes and forms. One could argue Amazon itself is a vendor agnostic. Reality is, if you're going to make the most use of Amazon, you get locked into its feature set and its product catalog. So suddenly, rather than using Amazon generically, you suddenly realize, okay, I'm using 32 Amazon products. In order to get off it, we're pretty much shafted. So you get caught in. So your exit strategy was actually slightly poor, because you actually didn't realize that you didn't realize or appreciate that you might want to one day get off it. And one of the key elements or a rule of thumb when you look at exit strategies generally is it's not moving your entire piece across, it's moving the piece that has value. And typically what I'm talking about is your data. If you've got the ability to move your data off, then you're in a good place, which means that you never vetted a particular platform, you're not commercially locked in, your business model is slightly adaptable. It means you get the fluidity to actually move that data around and do different things to it. In the world that we exist now, data is very, very key. We're harnessing data. Ultimately, even if you look at businesses generally, from a data-centric perspective, you might be a data generator, you might be a data aggregator, a data manipulator, or a data consumer. You fall into one of the camps, or maybe one or more. But reality is, it's moving into one of those worlds. Your business model might change at any moment in time. On one hand, you might be a business generator, but suddenly realize we're actually aggregating business data as well, because we're doing value creation through other data that's being generated out there. A company, for example, might be doing, you might be kind of putting data out there like research. Let's pick research as an example, analytics. So you're doing market research and you're a data generator for an industry, a Gartner or something. Suddenly you realize, actually, there's an entire world of social media and user-generated content that we can start dipping into. So not only are you a data generator, you're also a data creator, and you're a data creator, but also you're a data aggregator and a manipulator. So your business model is changing as well. And if your platforms are not conducive to that, what's your exit strategy to move to something else? So it's usually kind of it's a safe card to have in your back pocket. It's not like the be all and end all, but it just means that you're just smarter about how you pick and choose technologies.
The really interesting thing there is the data is one thing. I think you made a really great point there. If you create IP, if you create applications which you want to get a return on investment, and yet you are using third-party APIs, then you've almost got an obligation to find a way of abstracting those APIs. So you've got a pointer in your organisation to point to something else, and your logic survives.
Very true.
I just want to know, do you have a sample exit strategy in mind? Is it like using OpenStack or things like that?
Yes and no. In many cases, depending on the organization, open source or open standards versus proprietary and commercial, they both have their pros and cons.
OpenStack, so rather than using like AWS, build everything in OpenStack and then deploy on.
It gives you there's overheads. Overheads mean that there's an extra level of operational cost. You also have to ship the resources in. There's a management cost, a management layer, salaries, and in some cases, if you're just doing something that's quick and dirty, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go through the entire process. In other cases, using OpenStack means that for the same level of investment, you may as well have just picked a smarter platform and just slapped it on there in a slightly more generic fashion.
So what do you recommend as an exit strategy?
It's ultimately what I'd advise, which is what I've said earlier, is the first thing you look at is your data. Where's your value in the company? What does your value depend? As a company, where is your value? And then build off that. So a rule of thumb: if you can get your data off a platform very easily, you're in a safe place. Everything else can be kind of lifted and shifted accordingly, but your key commodity, which makes your company run and which gives you IP and puts you on the stock market, if you can keep that to yourself, which is where your real intellectual property is, you're in a good place. Everything else is bells and whistles, pretty much. So.
The question is different area. So is there a level of, like, for you, when you go to an organization, when you look at their operational maturity or immaturity, that you say, okay, no, you guys are mature enough to go, or no, you need to sort this and this and this?
So in many cases, it's being kind of being a realist, because there's a lot of typically when I get engaged in organizations, there's a lot of good intention, which is why I exist in terms of going into that company in the first place. The good intention is that they want to move to a better place. They're not sure how to do that, to make that journey, or in some cases even the business decision or the business strategy is kind of slightly fluffy and needs a bit more kind of structure to it before you can actually say this is the way we're heading. And what I tend to do is from there kind of pull back and say, okay, I can understand the goal that you're trying to get to, but in order for that to happen, these things need to take place. And then based upon that, you can say, okay, yes, you are mature, yes, you're not, or you're not mature, or maybe we need to look at the kind of org structure, maybe we need to look at the development teams, maybe we need to look at the delivery mechanism. In some cases, it's a regulated sector. So we may not necessarily even have the ability to move to cloud, which means, in some cases you have to kind of find the next best thing. In other cases, it's been the fact that they haven't been utilizing the technology correctly. They're already on the cloud, they're just not taking advantage of it. So yeah, it kind of varies, but yeah, I don't advocate people kind of shipping in and say, yep, let's do cloud. There's usually a lot of housekeeping that needs to be done internally as well. It's making sure that the house is in order before you kind of lift and shift it, because it is a big move, and also commercially it's a big investment as well. Because ultimately, if you're moving functionality from one place to another, there's a challenge, and you're also running a company. In some cases, there's implications on budgets because you may not have the budget ready. The CFO, board level investors are not happy for that risk to take place. So there's a lot of discussions that tend to happen as to is this a viable proposition in the first place. Some cases, C-level exec members have been bought into a particular technology because they've attended a seminar or they've been invited to some, a business dinner, which has been sponsored. And they walk away with an umbrella which is branded, and then suddenly they say, oh, that's the next best thing that we have to go to. And it's kind of pulling back and saying, okay, maybe you've been sold by the sales pitch, then let's introduce reality into the picture, and then suddenly realization is, okay, it's probably not the right thing. So.
Can I just ask, so you mentioned that the people are often overlooked and the impact to the existing organisation and how to create that transformation. And you also mentioned you've seen it fail several times.
Yeah.
What are the key things that make it fail?
Key things are adverse to change because people are cushy in comfortable jobs. They come in, they do their 9 to 5 clock in, clock out, and there's no reason for them to change because ultimately in 5 years' time they're going to be retired. That's one way. The other one is control, because ultimately what happens is when you introduce technologies such as cloud, in kind of different layers, depending on what you're looking at, hybrid, public, or whatever. Ultimately, it's about enabling the business, and suddenly that control is gone. If you look at architecture, which is kind of the world which I exist in to a certain extent, so but I would say 60% of my foot is in the architecture world, because ultimately all this kind of implication is that you're going to build something. And in architecture, what you find is in many companies, especially the ones that have been around for a very long time, there's also a culture that architecture is in this ivory tower. And what happens is, case in point is a document might be created, someone somewhere has an idea, a change is going to take place, architect gets asked to kind of carve up a document, high level document, it does the rounds. A month later, they convene, have a discussion, another document gets created, does the rounds, and what happens is, and it's not because the document's bad, it's because everyone wants to put their 2 pence in. Everyone wants to get involved. If you haven't got your signature in the document, you're not important. So you have to have your signature in the document, even though you don't know what the document's about. In many cases, technical design authorities, the guy actually who's written the paper presents the paper to the kind of the group. He or she is the only person who actually knows what's in the paper in the detail. Everyone else is just like, okay, looks good, sounds good. They'll ask a few questions, but then you get signed off. And that's the fear, is that culture, that status quo is going to change. The other point is the fact that it's new. New is also, in many cases, feared. It's the same kind of red herring about security. Security is the kind of thing that everyone uses as a way to say, no, it's dangerous, no, it shouldn't be allowed. Data location is another one. People say data, our data should be here, our data should be, and you say reality is, your end user device could be pretty much anywhere in the world, and in many cases people are actually guilty of it as well. They've gone overseas and accessed their emails, and suddenly you've got an instance of that data being sent to some next place. And then they log into Google and they realize, why is that American advert appearing when in dollars rather than pounds? And you realize, okay, your data is actually being shipped over to America without you realizing, just because you happen to access it there. And it becomes a bit of a ethereal conversation.
That's a real issue. So if any of your data gets over onto an American system, then they're subject to the Homeland Security rules, and they have to make that data available under the appropriate.
Yeah, it's the fear of because in many cases that hasn't been thought through, and what happens is they use these kind of analogies to say that it's not right for us. In many cases, the data location isn't actually relevant to that organization or the sector, and it just becomes this kind of fear factor, and it gets amplified. So. Oh no, I totally agree. Yeah.
So, for instance, if you receive any email that comes from a government servant, is automatically official.
Yeah.
So, and any system that receives official information is supposed to be analysed.
Yep.
And yet, substantive companies who've gone outsourcing have large chunks of their stuff happening in the Philippines or wherever.
Yeah, no.
So
It's because it's that thing about the uncontrolled endpoint. So although you might have a very secure system, at some point in time it's going to leak into another system, and it's because in many cases the security fears are actually very relevant and well founded.
We know from Snowden that the most likely impact is insider. The most likely security threat is insider threat.
Yes, yeah.
So, and yet you've got your systems that span the whole world.
Yeah.
So, where your data rests and who has access to it is a very, very material issue.
So, actually, a good example, just to illustrate that, is one of the organisations I'm working with. I'm kind of building an Internet of Things platform. The nature of Internet of Things is that your endpoint is very uncontrolled. You don't know because it's somebody's device, and they own that, and they own the access, they own the operating system technically, and the device. And suddenly you're basically harnessing that data, or that data is coming into your systems from an endpoint that you don't have control over. Pretty much most security models depend on a perimeter security, and what you're describing is that kind of thing that's gone outside, or that thing that's done from the inside out. And so the question is, okay, what kind of security model do you adopt? And if security is a big fear, how do you control or manage it? And reality is you can't really fully control it, because in many cases you don't have that control. So it's a realization. So one way to actually tackle security is by actually enabling your staff to be smarter. Education, that's one key way to actually get smarter security in an organization. And then also making them realize that if you do things, there's a leakage, and making them aware of the leakage points as well. I'm aware that through the GSI network, which is what you're describing, the government secure internet, you have things going back and forward from cloud, etc. And it happens on a daily basis. Everyone's pretty much guilty of it at some point. But even though everyone knows about it, it's kind of it's a complacency, and it's a complacency that gets you at the end. And yeah, so it's kind of, those are the reasons I've seen the fears, is because you're suddenly handing over control to people who are traditionally very used to being in control.
There's a big chance Hillary is going to lose the election because her email server.
Oh yes. So yeah, it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but yeah, this kind of what it boils down to is basically I would say 70% of the time is people fearing losing control. So.
Sorry, quick question. With adopting a new technology, there's usually a proof of concept or some model or some guinea pig.
Yeah.
Sometimes. But with cloud, it seems like you don't know the result until you put your foot in to the pond and you actually try it out for several years, because the implications aren't predictable. So how do you say we go and adopt something without a proof of concept?
What you do is typically pick a slice of functionality which will give you a business realization, and that's the way to approach cloud. So rather than saying, okay, we're going to move our entire company to cloud, pick a cloud platform, you say, let's pick a slice of business functionality, carve it up, and say, this is what we're going to use as a way to actually evaluate that cloud platform. The beauty of most of the cloud platforms now is that they will allow you to create non-production instances and actually try out that technology and actually see if it's right for you. So you rather invest about 100K in doing that kind of POC throwaway, not an MVP. It's kind of what you're talking about is a POC, is evaluation of a technology. If it works, fine. If it doesn't, you've lost 100K as opposed to maybe a few million, which you would have if you had gone into straight whole hog and realized it wasn't right for you.
From your experience, what sort of time span would you say is a good illustrator of the...
I'm going to shimmy that question slightly, because it depends on the appetite for change in the company. In many companies, they're very aggressive about timescales. So, and they also have the relevant resources and the commercials and the kind of the budgets in place. So a POC could be anything from it could be 2 sprints. So we're talking about maybe a month or so to get something up and running, so they can show it to the business. In other cases, which are slightly long-winded, the POC might be 3 months. I've come across kind of government agencies where they've tried to do POCs on big data. So taking existing functionality, and which is based on things like Informatica or Oracle, etc., and spinning up an instance in newer technology on newer platforms, but replicating a slice of functionality with a representative set of data, anonymized or otherwise, and saying, okay, is this right for us? In many cases, it's not been right. The reason is because the organization is not at the maturity level to actually appreciate that what that new technology can give you. It's too much of a change, and it's been so because if you think about it in government, it also boils down to jobs as well. And if you you know, just say, okay, we're going to move to the world of big data, and suddenly you have to make an entire floor of techies redundant, you know, PMs or service delivery managers, it's political. So politically, you may not be able to do it. So even though it's right technology-wise and it's right from a commercial perspective, politically it's going to be a nightmare of a story because, you know, all these civil servants have been made, you know, redundant. So you can't do it.
Can I just add though, it's not just the civil service.
That's just an example, but yeah, I totally appreciate it'll be replicated across multiple sectors. Yeah. So, but I would say actually, if you are fighting the case, is to show one way to succeed is to actually show the business the value of what cloud brings, because in many cases many business people don't care where the stuff is. It's a bit like you and I when we're using WhatsApp and all these over-the-top services. All these are cloud services, but we don't really think about, oh, my data's on this particular server and this particular cloud, etc. We just use the service, and it's an enabler. So that's the way to sell it. Is actually things happen faster, things happen quicker, it happens slicker, etc. And then you kind of point to analogies that they would use in their daily life, and that's the way to win business over. Because business doesn't really care whether you move into cloud or not. They just want to get things done faster, slicker, quicker, and cheaper. So yeah.
I've done POCs with petabytes of data in 2 to 3 days, and in some cases in about 3 to 4 months. So it just totally depends.
Yeah, yeah. It boils down to what the checkbook is like and what, you know, how people are willing to sign on it. So yeah.
Cool.
All done?
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you.
If we take another 5 or 10 minutes break.